The miners accidentally stumbled upon a mysterious coffin hidden deep underground. When they opened it, they couldn't believe their eyes. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories, and write in the comments where you're watching from. The sun had barely risen over the rugged peaks surrounding Silver Creek, a small mining town in the heart of Colorado, when the first shift of miners descended into the earth. The town itself was a relic of the gold rush era, with its weather-beaten wooden facades and rusting mining equipment scattered like skeletal remains along the hills. But, unlike its more prosperous neighbors, Silver Creek never truly found its fortune. The veins of gold had long since dried up, leaving the town to slowly wither. But recently, new life had been breathed into the old shafts. A geological survey, funded by a private corporation, suggested that beneath the played-out gold deposits lay something even more valuable: rare earth minerals. The promise of new wealth brought with it machinery, investment, and most importantly, jobs. For men like Dan Baxter, it was a lifeline. Dan was a veteran of the mines. In his mid-40s, with a lean, muscular frame, hardened by years of manual labor, he was known among the crew for his steady hands and sharper-than-average intuition. He had started working underground straight out of high school, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather. The dark, confined spaces that made others uneasy were, to him, as familiar as his own home. This morning, like many before it, Dan found himself deep within the bowels of the mountain. The air was damp and cool, with the omnipresent scent of stone dust and machinery oil. The rhythmic thud of drills and the clatter of metal against rock echoed through the narrow shafts. Miners moved in a steady, practiced rhythm, each motion a cog in the well-oiled machine of extraction. Dan was partnered with Mark Jensen, a younger miner with a quick wit and an infectious grin. The two had worked together for years, and their camaraderie made the grueling work more bearable. They were tasked with clearing debris from a newly blasted tunnel, their helmets' lights casting eerie shadows on the jagged walls. "Another day, another dollar," Mark said, his voice muffled by the dust mask. "If we're lucky," Dan replied, his tone laced with the dry humor that had become his trademark. The two worked in silence for a while, shoveling loose rock into a rusted metal cart. The work was monotonous, almost meditative, until a sudden change in the rhythm of Mark's pickaxe drew Dan's attention. The familiar crunch of stone had given way to a sharp, metallic ring. "Hold up," Dan said, raising a hand. "Did you hear that?" Mark froze mid-swing. "Yeah, that didn't sound right." Dan moved closer, kneeling in the dust. He brushed away debris with his gloved hand, revealing a sliver of something dark and smooth beneath the stone. He signaled for Mark to bring the light closer. Under the harsh beam, the surface caught a dull sheen, unlike any rock or metal Dan had ever seen. "What do you think it is?" Mark asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and caution. "No idea, but it's not natural. Too smooth." Dan tapped the surface with the edge of his pickaxe. The metal rang out, a clear, almost musical tone. The surrounding miners turned their heads, the noise cutting through the ambient clamor of the tunnel. Within moments, their small discovery had drawn a crowd. Jim Henderson, the shift supervisor, pushed through the gathered men. His weathered face was a map of old scars and a lifetime of grit. "What's going on here?" Dan stood, brushing off his knees. "We hit something. Doesn't look like bedrock or old equipment." Henderson squinted, then knelt down for a closer look. His fingers traced the edges of the exposed surface. "It's metal, but not rusted. How deep was it?" "About 8 feet into the rock. Whatever it is, it's been here a long time," Dan said. The supervisor stood, rubbing his jaw. "All right, everyone back to work. Dan, Mark, keep clearing this out, but go slow. I'm calling the engineers." The miners grumbled but obeyed, the curiosity replaced by the pragmatism of seasoned workers. Dan and Mark resumed their careful excavation, using smaller tools to avoid damaging the object. Inch by inch, they revealed more of the strange surface. It was rectangular, with edges too straight to be natural. The metal was cool to the touch, despite the surrounding rock being warm from the machinery. As they worked, strange patterns began to emerge on the metal. At first, they looked like scratches, but as more of the surface was cleared, they formed into deliberate, almost geometric designs. Dan felt a prickle of unease. He had seen old mining equipment, remnants of forgotten projects, but nothing like this. 2 hours later, the engineers arrived. A pair of men in orange vests and hard hats, they brought with them a portable scanner and a range of tools. They examined the metal, ran their devices over the surface, and conferred in low voices. The miners watched from a distance, their break extended by the growing mystery. Finally, Henderson approached Dan and Mark. "We're shutting down this section for now. Engineers need to run some tests. You two are reassigned to Tunnel 3. "What do you think it is?" Dan asked. Henderson's expression was unreadable. "I don't know. And until we do, I don't want anyone talking about it. Clear?" Dan nodded. Years in the mines had taught him the value of discretion. Still, as he moved to gather his tools, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled onto something much bigger than an old piece of equipment. That night, as Dan sat on his porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, the metallic ring of his pickaxe echoed in his mind. There was something down there, buried beneath layers of stone and time, and whatever it was, it didn't belong. The days following the discovery of the strange metal object brought a palpable shift in the atmosphere at Silver Creek. The usual camaraderie among the miners was replaced by a quiet unease. Rumors spread like wildfire, ignited by whispers and half-heard conversations in the mess hall. The object's existence had become an open secret, despite the supervisor's attempts to maintain discretion. Some claimed it was an old piece of mining equipment. Others speculated it was a buried relic from the gold rush, but none of the usual explanations fit. The object was too pristine, too foreign. 3 days after the initial discovery, a small team of experts arrived at the site. Leading them was Dr. John Howard, a historian from the University of Colorado in Boulder. He was in his late 50s, with silver hair and the measured demeanor of a man who had spent his life sifting through the detritus of history. Alongside him was Steve Mackenzie, a metallurgist whose expertise lay in identifying and analyzing rare alloys. The two men approached the object with a mix of academic curiosity and professional caution. Dan and Mark were reassigned to assist the experts. The tunnel where the object was found had been sectioned off, with temporary lighting strung up along the walls and a portable generator humming softly in the corner. The metal surface had been partially excavated, revealing more of its rectangular shape. It was about 8 feet long and 3 feet wide, with the same strange geometric patterns running along its edges. Dr. Howard knelt by the exposed surface, running his fingers gently over the designs. "These aren't random," he said almost to himself. "They look like some sort of code." Mackenzie, already setting up his equipment, glanced over. "You think it's writing?" "Possibly. Or technical schematics, but nothing I recognize." Howard's voice had a note of hesitation. "I expected something from the 1800s, but this, it feels wrong." Mackenzie activated a handheld scanner, its blue light washing over the metal. Let's see what the composition tells us. The scanner beeped and whirred, feeding data to a tablet in Mackenzie's hand. His brow furrowed as he read the screen. That's odd. The alloy doesn't match anything in the database. It's primarily iron, but the secondary elements are unidentifiable. Unidentifiable how? Dan asked, breaking the silence. Normally, the scanner would compare the spectrum to known metals and alloys, but whatever this is, it's not on record. It's too pure, almost synthetic. Howard stood, brushing the dust from his knees. We need to clear more of it. If it's a container or a structure, there might be an opening. Over the next several hours, Dan, Mark, and the two experts worked methodically, removing rock and debris from around the metal. As more of its surface was revealed, the object took on a more defined shape. It was indeed a container, with a seam running along its top and what appeared to be hinges along one side. The patterns on the metal became more intricate near what they assumed was the front, forming a circular emblem that none of them could identify. Howard took pictures, his camera's flash illuminating the strange symbols. I've seen military emblems, historical crests, but nothing like this. It feels modern, yet off. Mackenzie inspected the seam with the flashlight. It looks like it could be opened. There's a groove here, maybe a latch mechanism. Dan, who had been watching from a step back, spoke up. If this is some kind of container, we should be careful. We don't know what's inside. The suggestion hung in the air, a reminder that their curiosity could easily turn to danger. Howard nodded slowly. You're right. We should get more specialized equipment. We need to understand what we're dealing with before we crack it open. As they packed up for the day, the unease settled deeper into Dan's bones. He couldn't shake the feeling that the object was more than just a forgotten relic. It had a presence, a weight that went beyond its physical form. Back on the surface, the experts contacted the university and arranged for more equipment. The mining company, sensing the potential significance of the find, agreed to fund the research. Within a day, the object was the talk of the company. Engineers and geologists descended on Silver Creek, each bringing their own theories and tools. But despite the influx of knowledge, the mystery only deepened. 2 days later, the decision was made to open the container. The metal was too strong for traditional tools, so they brought in a portable plasma cutter. The plan was simple. Make a controlled incision along the seam and pry the lid open. The miners gathered at a distance, their curiosity tempered by caution. Dan and Mark stood near the entrance to the tunnel, their helmets casting long shadows on the rock walls. As the cutter ignited, its bright arc illuminated the chamber. The metal hissed and sparked, but held firm. It took nearly an hour to slice through the seam, and even then the lid resisted. It was as if the container did not want to be opened. Finally, with a groan and creak, the top shifted. Mackenzie and Howard worked together, leveraging metal bars into the gap until the lid slid to the side. What lay inside stole the breath from every man in the tunnel. The interior of the container was filled with a transparent, slightly viscous liquid, tinged with a faint pink hue, and floating within it, suspended as if in a dream, was a man. His skin was pale but lifelike, his features perfectly preserved. He had a strong jawline, short dark hair, and was dressed in what appeared to be a military uniform. The fabric was unlike anything they had seen, gray and smooth, with patches and insignias that bore the same strange symbols as the exterior of the container. Dan felt the air thicken around him, the weight of centuries pressing down. The man in the container looked no older than 40, his body unmarked by decay. The liquid surrounded him like a cocoon, giving him an ethereal, almost serene appearance. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the generator and the soft drip of condensation from the tunnel walls. "Is he dead?" Mark whispered. Mackenzie checked his scanner, his hands trembling. "There's no sign of life, no pulse, no heat, but what?" Howard asked, his voice thin. "The tissue readings, they're normal. There's no decomposition. It's as if he just fell asleep." A shiver ran through the group. It was impossible. The container had been buried for decades, maybe longer, and yet the man looked as if he could open his eyes at any moment. Howard moved closer, his breath fogging the glass-like surface of the liquid. "We need to get him out. This could be the discovery of a lifetime." Dan took a step back, his instincts screaming at him. There was something wrong, something unnatural about the entire situation. But the momentum had shifted. The experts were in control now, and all he could do was watch as they prepared to extract the man from his watery grave. As they readied their tools, Dan couldn't shake the feeling that they had just opened a door that should have remained closed, and whatever lay beyond it was only beginning to reveal itself. The weight of the moment hung in the damp air of the tunnel, pressing down on the gathered men. The body inside the container remained perfectly still, suspended in the strange pinkish liquid, his expression eerily serene. The miners, who had spent their lives surrounded by the certainty of rock and soil, now found themselves staring at something that defied explanation. Dr. Howard was the first to regain his composure. He quickly pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket and began scribbling observations, his fingers moving with urgency. Mackenzie, still clutching his scanner, was muttering to himself, running new diagnostics on the liquid and the metallic interior of the container. Dan stood back, arms crossed, watching the two experts work. His gut told him this wasn't something they should be tampering with. There was something deeply unnatural about the whole situation, and every instinct in his body screamed that they were stepping into something far bigger than they understood. Howard, oblivious to the growing tension in the tunnel, turned to Mackenzie. "We need to extract him. Carefully. This fluid, whatever it is, has preserved him perfectly. If we can analyze it, we might understand how." Mackenzie nodded, his usual scientific detachment overtaking his initial shock. "I'll collect a sample first. We need to know what we're dealing with before we remove the body." He reached into his bag and retrieved a small vial and a syringe. Stepping cautiously forward, he dipped the syringe into the liquid and pulled the plunger. The fluid moved sluggishly, almost like a gel. When he held the vial up to the light, it shimmered faintly, reflecting the glow of the portable floodlights. "That's strange," Mackenzie murmured. "It reacts to light." Howard peered closer. "Is it organic?" Mackenzie shook his head. "I don't know, but it's not behaving like any known preservative." Dan exhaled sharply. "You sure it's safe to open this thing up any further? We don't even know what that stuff is." Howard shot him an annoyed glance. "Dan, this is a controlled environment. We've worked with unknown substances before. This could be the most significant discovery in decades." Dan bit back his retort. There was no point arguing with men who had already convinced themselves they were making history. Mackenzie moved on to the next step, setting up a small portable suction pump to drain the liquid. The plan was simple. Extract enough of the fluid to safely remove the body without disturbing its integrity. As the pump whirred to life, the liquid slowly receded, exposing more of the man's uniform. The insignia on his chest, which had been obscured by the floating fluid, became clearer. A patch with the same strange circular emblem as the exterior of the container was stitched onto the fabric. Below it, partially hidden by folds of cloth, were 3 small letters, U.S. Dan felt a chill crawl up his spine. "He's American." Howard stiffened. He exchanged a glance with Mackenzie, who immediately checked the insignia again. "It does look like U.S. military," Mackenzie admitted, "but I've never seen this kind of uniform before. No known division uses this emblem." Howard frowned. "We'll need to run a comparison against historical records. If he was part of a classified operation, there might be no public record." Dan let out a slow breath. "So, what now?" Howard straightened. "We remove him." Carefully, with the expertise of surgeons, they lifted the man from the container. As soon as his body was free from the last traces of the liquid, a sudden reaction occurred. His skin, which had been an almost perfect shade of preserved pale, darkened slightly, as if exposed to air for the first time in centuries. His lips, barely parted, took on a faintly blue hue. Mackenzie cursed. "He's drying out too fast." Howard grabbed a damp cloth, pressing it against the man's forehead, but it made little difference. The change was rapid, unnatural. "We need to keep his body temperature stable," Howard said quickly. "Get him wrapped up now." They laid the man out on a stretcher and covered him in thermally insulated sheets, while Mackenzie placed a scanner over his chest. He was checking for any last signs of life, but the screen displayed nothing. "No heartbeat, no brain activity," Mackenzie confirmed. But what?" Dan asked. "The cellular integrity is intact. There's no sign of decay. If I didn't know better, I'd say he could wake up any second." Silence followed. The idea was absurd. The man had been sealed in a container buried deep in the rock for decades, maybe longer, and yet his body was pristine, his features untouched by time. It was impossible. Howard, regaining his composure, turned to the miners. "We need to get him topside. I'll arrange transport to Boulder immediately." Jim Henderson, the shift supervisor, who had been watching silently until now, finally spoke. His voice was firm. "I don't like this, Howard. This is turning into something bigger than we signed up for." Howard fixed him with a level stare. "Then let me handle it." Henderson hesitated. Then, with a slow nod, he stepped aside. "Fine. But whatever this is, I want it out of my mind by morning." Howard wasted no time. He made a call from the surface, arranging a private transport to take the body to a secure lab in Boulder. A few hours later, a black SUV arrived, its windows tinted, its driver saying little beyond confirming orders. The body was carefully placed inside, along with the extracted samples. Howard, Mackenzie, and a few assistants climbed in after it. Dan watched as the SUV's taillights disappeared down the dirt road, leading away from Silver Creek. A strange sensation settled in his stomach, one he hadn't been able to shake since they first uncovered the metal. Mark stood beside him, arms crossed. "So, what do you think?" he asked quietly. Dan didn't answer right away. He thought of the man in the container, his impossibly preserved body, his uniform marked with an unfamiliar emblem. He thought of the moment the liquid had been drained and how the skin had darkened as if responding to something in the air. "Something about this doesn't sit right," Dan finally said. Mark nodded. "Yeah, feels like we kicked over a hornet's nest." Dan exhaled, glancing up at the darkening sky. He had the distinct feeling that whatever they had just uncovered was far from over, and whatever truth lay buried beneath Silver Creek, it was about to come to the surface. The black SUV carrying the preserved man had vanished into the night, leaving behind an unsettling silence in Silver Creek. Dan Baxter watched until its taillights faded beyond the hills, then turned back toward the mine, his thoughts clouded with unease. For the first time in his long years underground, he felt as if something had been disturbed that was never meant to be. He had seen cave-ins, gas leaks, and equipment failures, but this was different. The Earth had given up something that didn't belong in any time or place he understood. The rest of the shift passed in strained quiet. The miners returned to their duties, but the usual banter and grumbling were absent. Everyone was thinking the same thing. They had found something impossible, and now it was gone, taken by men who had no interest in explaining it to them. By morning, Henderson confirmed what many had suspected. The mine was temporarily shutting down in the area where the container had been found. The company cited safety concerns, but nobody believed that. Whatever was in that sarcophagus, the higher-ups wanted it kept quiet. Dan didn't go home immediately after his shift. Instead, he stopped at Mark's place, a small, cluttered trailer on the outskirts of town. The two had been through enough together to know when something wasn't right, and Dan needed to talk. Inside, Mark poured them both a drink. Cheap whiskey, but strong enough to burn the edge off the unease that had settled in Dan's gut. "You ever seen anything like that before?" Mark asked, leaning against the kitchen counter. Dan shook his head. "Not even close, and I don't think we're supposed to." Mark exhaled. "Feels like one of those things that just disappears, you know? We're not going to hear anything about it again." Dan didn't answer, but he knew Mark was right. This wasn't something the world was supposed to know about. While the miners were left in the dark, Dr. Howard and Mackenzie were already deep into their analysis at a private laboratory in Boulder. The facility, a low-profile research center with government connections, was the perfect place to examine something that wasn't meant for the public eye. Howard had spent the drive back going over his initial observations, but now, under proper lighting and controlled conditions, he could begin to understand the true scope of what they had found. The body had been carefully moved to a sealed examination room where climate and humidity could be adjusted. The strange liquid that had preserved the man was stored separately, ready for testing. Mackenzie had already begun his metallurgical analysis of the container. What he found made even less sense than what they had seen in the mine. "This alloy doesn't exist," Mackenzie muttered, staring at the spectrometer's results. "Not in any records we have." Howard leaned over his shoulder. "What do you mean?" Mackenzie pointed at the screen. "It's iron-based, but there's an element in here we can't identify. It's not in any periodic table we know of." Howard frowned. "An unknown element? That's impossible." Mackenzie nodded. "Yeah, well, so is a perfectly preserved body from 1953, but here we are." Meanwhile, the team studying the liquid had their own unsettling discoveries. The chemical analysis showed it wasn't just a preservative. It had biological properties. Some of the compounds reacted to oxygen exposure, changing structure in ways they couldn't explain. More disturbingly, when exposed to human skin, the liquid absorbed into the surface almost instantly, leaving no trace. Howard stood over the examination table, looking at the preserved man. His features remained unchanged, as though he had simply closed his eyes for a moment and might wake up at any second. One of the assistants hesitated before speaking. "Dr. Howard, are we sure he's dead?" Howard turned sharply. "There's no heartbeat, no brain activity, no respiration." "But his cells aren't breaking down," the assistant pressed. The tissue is still alive at a cellular level. Howard didn't like where this was going. That's not possible. The assistant hesitated. It shouldn't be, but none of this should be. As they continued their studies, Howard turned to historical records, trying to find any mention of a missing soldier matching the man's description. Hours of searching through military archives, classified reports, and Cold War-era documents yielded nothing. No known operations in 1953 placed a military unit in that part of Colorado. No missing persons reports matched the preserved man's face. Then, late into the night, Howard found something. It was a declassified document from the early days of the U.S. space program, discussing a series of experimental projects designed for extreme environments. One phrase stood out: Project Orion, Long-Term Human Preservation Initiative. Howard's pulse quickened. The official records claimed Project Orion had been an early study into nuclear-powered spacecraft, but this hinted at something else. He cross-referenced the project with the insignia found on the uniform. A deeper search pulled up an obscure reference in an internal military memo from 1953. It mentioned a transportation convoy that had gone missing in Colorado. The convoy had been carrying classified experimental cargo. No further details were included. The official explanation: equipment failure and loss of personnel. Howard sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The missing convoy, the unidentified metal container, the man inside, perfectly preserved. This was connected. While Howard and Mackenzie worked through the mystery, Dan Baxter received a call late that night. The voice on the other end was barely above a whisper. "You need to get out of town now." Dan frowned. "Who is this?" "Someone who knows when things are about to go bad." The voice was tense. "They're watching everyone who was in that mine. Whatever you found, it wasn't meant to be found." Dan stiffened. "Who's they?" But the line went dead. A cold sensation spread through his chest. He glanced out the window of his small home. The street was dark and quiet. Too quiet. A car sat parked down the road, its headlights off. It had been there earlier, and now that he thought about it, it had been there the night before too. Dan closed his phone and moved away from the window. Something wasn't right. The next morning, when Howard arrived at the lab, he was met with chaos. The guards were on high alert. The security cameras had been disabled for several hours overnight. And, most disturbing of all, Mackenzie was missing. His workstation was still active, his last notes left half-finished. The last recorded security footage showed him leaving the lab at 1:13 a.m., but his car was still in the parking lot. His phone was found on his desk. He had simply vanished. Howard felt his stomach turn. This was no accident. Someone had taken Mackenzie. The implications were clear. They weren't just studying history anymore. History was studying them back, and it was making sure its secrets remained buried. The morning after Mackenzie's disappearance, Dr. Howard arrived at the lab to find the building locked down. Security personnel, more than usual, were stationed at the entrances, their expressions grim, their postures rigid. The usual research assistants had been sent home. Only a few high-clearance personnel were allowed inside. Something had shifted overnight, and Howard didn't need to be told that the situation had escalated beyond his control. The moment he stepped through the main doors, two men in dark suits approached him. They were the kind of men who didn't introduce themselves, didn't need to. Their presence alone made it clear who they represented. "Dr. Howard," one of them said, his voice steady, measured. "You need to come with us." Howard felt a slow pulse of dread settle in his gut, but he nodded and followed. They led him down a hallway that should have been familiar, but today felt foreign. The usual background hum of the laboratory, machines beeping, voices discussing data, was gone. The sterile white walls felt colder, the fluorescent lights harsher. They brought him to a conference room, empty except for a man sitting at the head of the long table. He was older, his gray hair neatly combed, his dark eyes unreadable. There was no need for introductions. This was the kind of man who was never named in official records, who existed in the margins of classified documents. Howard sat across from him. The door clicked shut behind him. "Where is Dr. Mackenzie?" Howard asked, keeping his voice even. The man leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "Dr. Mackenzie is no longer part of this project." Howard's stomach tightened. That wasn't an answer. It was a confirmation that something had happened to Mackenzie and that Howard wouldn't be getting details. "His research?" Howard pressed. "Confiscated." Howard exhaled slowly. "Why?" The man studied him for a long moment before answering. "You've uncovered something that was never meant to be found, Dr. Howard. Something that predates your authority. And now it's being handled appropriately." Howard's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to keep his expression neutral. "You mean it's being buried?" The man didn't blink. "That's not your concern." Howard clenched his jaw, his frustration mounting. "This is a discovery of unprecedented scientific significance. That body, it wasn't just preserved, it's intact. His cells aren't dead. Do you realize what that means?" "We do," the man said, "which is why you will no longer be involved." Howard felt a chill creep up his spine. "You can't just erase this." "We can," the man said, standing, "and we will." Howard sat in stunned silence as the man turned to leave. But before he reached the door, he paused. "Go home, Dr. Howard. Forget this ever happened." Howard didn't move, didn't speak. He understood what that meant. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning. The door closed, and he was left alone in the cold, silent room. Dan Baxter was no stranger to trouble. Years in the mines had taught him when to push and when to back down. But this wasn't the kind of trouble he could handle with his fists or a quick remark. He had barely slept after the anonymous phone call. The feeling of being watched, of something closing in around him, was impossible to shake. The car that had been parked down the road for the past 2 nights was still there. Same dark windows, same stillness. He didn't like it. By the time morning came, Dan had made up his mind. He needed to get out of town, at least for a little while, until he knew what the hell was going on. But before he could even pack a bag, his phone rang again. He answered without speaking. "You need to leave now," the voice said. "They're coming." Dan stood, his muscles tensing. "Who the hell are you?" "Get in your truck. Drive. Don't go home. Don't talk to anyone." The line went dead. Dan didn't waste time. He grabbed his keys and headed straight for his truck. As he pulled out of his driveway, he glanced in his rearview mirror. The car down the street was no longer parked. It was following him. By midday, the mine was in complete lockdown. Henderson, the shift supervisor, stood at the gates, his arms crossed as he watched a convoy of government vehicles roll in. Men in tactical gear surrounded the perimeter, their weapons visible but not raised. A clear message. No one in, no one out. A group of men in suits, led by the same gray-haired official who had spoken to Howard, entered the mine without hesitation. They knew exactly where they were going. The tunnel where the sarcophagus had been found was already empty, of course. The container, the body, everything had been removed days ago, But they weren't here for that. They were here to make sure there was nothing left behind. Henderson watched as teams moved in with heavy equipment. Not mining tools, demolition charges. The realization settled in his gut like a rock. They weren't just sealing the tunnel. They were destroying it. Hours later, the first controlled detonations shook the ground, collapsing the section of the mine where history had been unearthed. Dust and smoke billowed out of the entrance, coating the surrounding area in a fine layer of debris. When the dust settled, it was as if nothing had ever been there. The mine would remain closed. Officially, due to structural instability, no records of the discovery would exist. Whatever they had found in Silver Creek was now buried under thousands of tons of rock, and it was never meant to be uncovered again. Dan Baxter had been driving for nearly 4 hours, sticking to back roads and avoiding highways. His truck rumbled steadily beneath him, the familiar hum of the engine doing little to settle the gnawing unease in his gut. The further he got from Silver Creek, the more he expected the tension in his chest to loosen, but it didn't. If anything, it grew tighter. The car that had been following him was gone now. At least, he hadn't seen it for the past 2 hours. But he wasn't naive enough to believe he had truly lost whoever was behind it. They had found him once. They would find him again. He pulled into a gas station off a nearly deserted stretch of road, stepping out to fuel up. The air was cold, the late evening creeping in with a quiet stillness. As he stood there, he caught his reflection in the dusty window of the station. He looked tired, worn. He had seen some bad things in his life, but nothing like this. Nothing that made him feel like the ground he stood on wasn't solid anymore. He paid in cash, avoiding eye contact with the attendant, then got back in his truck and kept driving. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he couldn't go back. Hours later, as he neared the state line, his phone rang. He hesitated before answering. "You're still alive," the voice said, the same voice that had warned him before. "For now," Dan muttered. "You need to be careful. They're watching everyone from that mine." Dan gripped the steering wheel. "Who the hell are they?" The line was quiet for a moment. Then, "Government, mostly, but not the kind that follows the law. Whatever you found, it was never supposed to see daylight. And now they're making sure it disappears." Dan's grip tightened. "Mackenzie, the scientist, he's gone." "I know." Dan exhaled through his nose, the rage and frustration simmering just beneath his skin. "Why are you helping me?" Another pause. "Because I was in your shoes once, and I made the wrong choice." The line went dead. Dan stared at his phone, then at the road ahead. He had 2 choices: keep running or find out what the hell was really going on. He knew which one was smarter. But he also knew which one he was going to choose. Back in Boulder, Dr. John Howard sat alone in his apartment, the blinds drawn, his laptop open to a blank document. He hadn't been able to sleep since Mackenzie vanished. The lab was locked down. His research had been confiscated. His access to the facility was revoked. It was like he had never even been part of the project. But he had seen too much to just let it go. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but no words came. He knew the risks. He had already been warned once. If he pushed further, there would be no turning back. His mind drifted back to the preserved man, the impossible body that shouldn't have existed, that defied all logic, and the insignia on his uniform, Project Orion. Officially, it had been a nuclear propulsion program in the 1950s. The U.S. government's attempt to develop spacecraft powered by atomic explosions. That was what the history book said. But if the preserved man was connected to it, then the truth was something else entirely. Howard reached for his notebook, the one he had managed to hide when the agents came through the lab. He flipped through the pages, stopping at the sketches of the symbols they had found on the container. His eyes traced the lines, the strange insignia. The feeling he had in the mine came back, stronger now. The government wasn't just covering up an anomaly, they were covering up a mistake. The people of Silver Creek didn't ask questions. The mine was closed indefinitely, and that was all the company said. There were whispers, of course, workers talking in hushed voices over drinks, rumors passing through the town like wildfire. Some said it was a structural failure. Others, that the government had found something buried deep in the rock and didn't want anyone to know about it. No one had answers. Then the disappearances started. First, it was Tom Wilkins, a miner who had been there the day they found the container. His wife woke up one morning and he was gone. No note, no signs of struggle, just gone. Then there was Kyle Dempsey, another worker who had been in the tunnel that day. He had been seen leaving the bar late one evening. He never made it home. By the end of the week, 5 men were missing, and that was when people stopped talking. The fear became something real, something you could feel in the air. Silver Creek was a small town. People noticed when their neighbors vanished, and the message was clear. Forget. Forget what you saw. Forget what you know. Dan wasn't going to forget. After the phone call, he had driven to the nearest motel and checked in under a fake name, paying in cash. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his phone. He still had Howard's number. He dialed. The doctor picked up on the first ring. Dan? I need to know what's going on. Howard's voice was strained. You need to stay off the grid. They're cleaning house. I noticed, Dan said bitterly. Howard was silent for a moment. Then he said, I found something about Project Orion. Dan leaned forward. Tell me. Howard hesitated. Not over the phone. Meet me in Denver, midnight. I'll text you the address. Dan knew this was a bad idea, but he also knew he didn't have a choice. If he wanted the truth, he had to go looking for it. And the closer he got, the more dangerous it became. Dan Baxter drove through the darkened streets of Denver, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement. The address Dr. Howard had sent him was in an older part of town, far from the gleaming skyscrapers and business districts. It was the kind of place where people minded their own business, where nobody asked questions. He parked his truck a few blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, keeping to the shadows, his instincts guiding him. Something about this meeting felt off. Not because he didn't trust Howard. He did, as much as anyone in this situation could, but because nothing about this was safe. He had seen what happened to people who got too close to the truth. When he reached the building, an old, abandoned warehouse, he hesitated. Howard had told him to come alone, but that didn't mean someone else wasn't waiting. Dan took a deep breath, then pushed open the heavy door. Inside, the air smelled of rust and old wood. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering slightly. Howard was there, pacing near a table covered in old documents and folders. He looked up the moment Dan stepped inside, relief flashing across his face. You made it, Howard said, exhaling. Good. Dan shut the door behind him. Tell me what you found. Howard gestured to the table. Everything I could dig up on Project Orion. The real Project Orion. Dan stepped closer, scanning the documents. Some were old military reports, others were declassified memos, yellowed with age. One image stood out, A black and white photo of a group of men in military uniforms standing beside a large, unmarked transport truck. His stomach twisted. The man at the center of the photo was the same man they had found in the mine. Dan picked up the photo. "This is him." Howard nodded. "I cross-referenced every insignia we found on his uniform. This unit didn't officially exist, at least not in any records available to the public." Dan frowned. "So, what were they?" Howard pulled out another folder, flipping through pages until he found what he was looking for. "I found a memorandum from 1953. It references a biological stasis experiment under the Orion designation. The goal wasn't nuclear propulsion, at least not in the way the public was told. The real project involved long-term human preservation." Dan's pulse quickened. "Like cryogenics?" Howard shook his head. "No, this wasn't freezing. Whatever they did, it was something else. Something we still don't understand. That liquid he was submerged in, it wasn't just preserving him, it was keeping him alive at a cellular level." Dan exhaled sharply. "That's why they're covering it up." Howard's expression darkened. "That's part of it, but there's more." He slid another document across the table. This one was stamped "Top Secret Eyes Only." The faded ink was barely legible in some places, but Dan could make out enough. The Orion subject has exhibited signs of biological adaptation beyond projected parameters. Cellular activity remains stable despite prolonged stasis. Further study required before reintegration. Dan's grip tightened on the paper. They weren't just trying to preserve him, they were experimenting on him. Howard nodded grimly. "And it wasn't just him." Dan looked up. "What do you mean?" Howard hesitated, then reached into his bag, pulling out another photograph. This one was grainier, as if taken in secret. It showed a large underground facility, rows of identical metal containers lined up in perfect symmetry. "There were more," Howard said quietly. "Dozens." Dan felt his stomach drop. The man they had found wasn't the only one. There were others. And if the government was willing to bury one, what had happened to the rest? Before Dan could speak, the distant sound of tires screeching against pavement made both men freeze. Howard's face paled. "We have to go, now." Dan grabbed as many documents as he could, stuffing them into his jacket. Howard did the same, shoving papers into his briefcase before snapping it shut. A moment later, headlights flooded the warehouse windows. Dan swore under his breath. They had been followed. Howard grabbed his arm. "There's a back exit, this way." They sprinted toward the rear of the building, just as the front door burst open. Shadows moved inside, dark figures silhouetted against the dim light. Dan didn't wait to see who they were. He and Howard crashed through the back door into an alley, the cold night air slamming into them. The sound of approaching footsteps followed, fast and precise. "They're right behind us," Howard panted. Dan grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the street. "Get to my truck." They ran. Behind them, a voice shouted, "Stop!" Dan ignored it. He reached his truck, yanked the door open, and shoved Howard inside before diving into the driver's seat. The first bullet shattered the side mirror. Dan slammed the accelerator. The truck roared forward, tires screeching against the pavement as they tore out of the alley. In the rearview mirror, Dan saw the men in suits watching them go, their faces blank, their expressions unreadable. They hadn't expected Dan to be there. They had been after Howard, and now they were after both of them. Dan didn't slow down until they were miles outside the city, the dark highway stretching endlessly before them. Only then did he glance at Howard. The doctor was shaken, his hands gripping the briefcase so tightly his knuckles were white. Dan exhaled. We're in it now. Howard nodded. Yeah. Dan tightened his grip on the wheel. Where do we go next? Howard opened his briefcase and pulled out the grainy photo of the underground facility. He traced a finger along the edge of the image, his voice steady but tense. We find the others. Dan didn't take his eyes off the road, but he felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. The government had buried one secret. Now they had to uncover the rest. The highway stretched out endlessly before them, a dark ribbon cutting through the Colorado wilderness. Dan Baxter gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror for any sign of pursuit. The headlights of distant cars blurred in the night, but none seemed to be following them. Not yet. Beside him, Dr. Howard was hunched over the pile of stolen documents, flipping through them with feverish intensity. Every so often, he would mutter something under his breath, cross-referencing one paper with another. The tension in the truck was thick, the air heavy with the weight of what they had uncovered. Dan glanced at him. Anything useful? Howard didn't look up. More than I hoped, less than we need. Explain. Howard took a slow breath. Project Orion wasn't about space travel, at least not in the way the public was told. The real project was focused on long-term human stasis. The government was experimenting with ways to preserve soldiers, elite personnel, for deployment in future conflicts. They believed that if they could perfect suspended animation, they could maintain an army indefinitely, waken soldiers only when needed. No aging, no degradation, no loss of skill. Dan frowned. And the guy we found in the mine? Howard hesitated. He was one of them, but something went wrong. The convoy transporting him and possibly others never made it to its destination. The official records say it was lost in transit. No further explanation. Dan exhaled sharply. And the facility in the photo? Howard tapped the grainy image of the underground complex. If this is real, then he wasn't the only one. There could be more, maybe dozens of them, still out there, still in stasis. Dan let that sink in. And the government wants to make sure no one finds them. Howard nodded. They buried the first one we uncovered, literally, and they're eliminating anyone who asks too many questions. Dan was quiet for a moment. So, where's this facility? Howard rifled through the documents again, then pulled out an old, faded blueprint. He traced a line with his finger. Northern Wyoming. An abandoned military installation, decommissioned in the late 60s. But if these records are accurate, it was never truly shut down. Dan sighed. Of course it wasn't. Howard folded the map. If we can get inside, we might find out what really happened, who these men were, why they were left behind. Dan flexed his fingers against the steering wheel. And then what? We wake them up? Tell them they've been frozen for 70 years? Howard didn't answer immediately. I don't know, but if we don't, no one ever will, and the people responsible for this, they'll erase every trace of it. Dan grunted. Sounds like a suicide mission. Howard managed a dry smile. Most discoveries worth making are. They drove in silence for the next few hours, neither willing to voice the obvious, that the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous things became. By the time they crossed into Wyoming, dawn was breaking over the horizon. The abandoned military site was still another 200 miles north, tucked deep into federal land, long forgotten by the world. Or so they thought. As they neared the outskirts of the area marked on Howard's map, Dan slowed the truck. The road was cracked and overgrown, the remains of a faded government sign barely visible beneath layers of rust, and just beyond the tree line, half hidden by the dense brush, was a black SUV, parked, waiting. Dan clenched his jaw. We're not the only ones looking for this place. Howard's breath hitched. They knew we'd come. Dan turned the truck around in a slow, deliberate motion. He kept his speed steady, trying not to draw attention. But as soon as he pulled back onto the main road, the SUV's engine roared to life. "Hold on," Dan muttered. The chase began. The SUV closed in fast, its headlights blinding in the side mirror. Dan pushed the gas pedal to the floor, the truck groaning as it picked up speed. The road ahead twisted through the hills, patches of gravel making the tires skid dangerously with every sharp turn. "Dan!" Howard shouted as another black vehicle appeared from a side road, cutting off their escape route. Dan didn't hesitate. He veered off the road entirely, the truck bouncing violently as it tore through the underbrush. Tree branches scraped against the windshield, dirt and rocks kicking up in their wake. The SUVs followed, their engines growling, their drivers relentless. Gunshots rang out. Howard ducked. "They're shooting at us." "No kidding," Dan barked, yanking the wheel hard. The truck fishtailed, barely missing a jagged rock formation before leveling out. Another shot shattered the passenger side window. Howard swore. Dan spotted a narrow ravine up ahead, a steep drop with only a thin dirt path running along the edge. He had one chance. "Brace yourself." He slammed the wheel to the right. The truck skidded sideways, barely holding traction as it hugged the curve. The lead SUV wasn't so lucky. It overcorrected, its tires losing grip, and in a heartbeat it was airborne, flipping end over end before vanishing into the ravine below. Howard stared, wide-eyed. "Holy, not out of this yet?" Dan interrupted. The second SUV was still behind them. More gunfire. The rear windshield exploded in a shower of glass. Dan gritted his teeth, pushing the truck harder. Then, up ahead, a tunnel. An old, abandoned mining shaft cut straight into the mountainside. It was narrow, unstable, but it was their only chance. Dan gunned the engine. The truck roared into the darkness. Behind them, the second SUV skidded to a stop. The men inside hesitated. They knew better than to follow blindly. Dan and Howard sat in the pitch-black silence, their breaths heavy. Dust swirled in the dim light of the dashboard. For the moment, they were safe. But this wasn't over. Howard looked at him, his voice hushed but firm. "They'll keep coming." Dan exhaled. "Yeah, I know." Howard glanced at the documents in his lap, the answers they had risked everything for. The government wanted this buried, and they had nearly succeeded. But now, two men knew the truth, and the truth had a way of getting out. Dan turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. They still had a long way to go. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Check out our other videos for more intriguing stories and share this one with others who might find it just as fascinating. Thanks for watching.